Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Devin Krotman, prize manager for the Barbara Bush Foundation Adult Literacy XPRIZE. Today's Google Hangout on Air will be a Q&A session with Nir, who's the author of the book Hooked, which focuses on habit-forming technology. So Nir, I'm going to pass it off to you, and we can go through some of the questions. And I want to allow everyone to kind of type questions using the Q&A app during this, and I can relay those questions to Nir at the end of this presentation. Thank you. Go ahead, Nir.
All right, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. So I can't see how many people we have joining us. Can you see that anywhere?
The number of viewers is 1 right now, but that will increase. It takes a while for Google Hangouts to account for all the viewers, so that'll take a few seconds.
Okay, as long as we got somebody.
Sounds good.
All right, so yeah, so my name is Nir Eyal. I wrote this book called Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and it's all about how products and services can change consumer behavior and consumer habits. I also teach a class at the Graduate School of Business and the Design School at Stanford, and the focus of my research and teaching is all about consumer behavior and consumer psychology. And so what we wanted to do today is to figure out how we could apply some of the principles of consumer psychology to adult literacy. And so you all have submitted some questions here, which is fantastic, and I'm happy to dive right in. So why don't we spend the next 30 minutes or so just diving into these questions and seeing how many we can bang out here. I will say that I will be answering these questions assuming that you've had a chance to read my book. It's a relatively short book. It shouldn't take more than a couple hours to digest. And it's a really great primer, not because I'm trying to sell you books. Frankly, I only make a couple bucks per book, so it's not for the money. It's for this passion that I have for helping entrepreneurs, helping people who are designing products and services, build products and services that people actually will use. Something that's frustrated me quite a bit over the past several years living in Silicon Valley is that I see a lot of amazing technologies made by a lot of amazingly smart people that nobody wants to use. And that has to stop because we're just wasting our time and our talents building technical solutions for psychological problems. And that's no good. We have to figure out how to leverage consumer psychology so that people will actually use the stuff we build. So as a first step, read the book. It won't take you very long, and it'll give you a framework for how to think of habit-forming products. And a lot of the terminology I'm going to use today really uses that as the springboard. And the basis of the book is called the Hook Model. The Hook Model is this 4-step process of a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment that through successive cycles, through these hooks that are designed, that are built into all sorts of habit-forming products, this is how consumer preferences are shaped and habits are formed. So let's dive into the questions and see how far we can get here. The first question is, what would be good to know is how to engage all these age groups with a single application. Any tricks would be delightfully helpful. Or definitely, sorry, definitely helpful. So yeah, just being an author does not make you a good reader, obviously. So the question here is around, how do we build for different age groups? And this is a great question in terms of that it relates to the fundamentals of good design are also about understanding your user. Having user empathy is immensely important. Why is it so important? Well, because what's difficult for one user is going to be very easy for another user. What's appealing to one user is going to be unappealing to a different user. So when it comes to designing for different age groups or different nationalities or different interest groups, we've got to be able to closely, to very deeply understand our user. And the only way to do that is to do user research. That products tend to be built inside office buildings, right? We tend to have a bunch of creative people sit around and discuss how to build a product for somebody else. That's no good. We have to involve the user at the very earliest stages of our product design so that we're empathetic with our user. And so this answers the question around how do we design for one user group versus another. I don't know. I can't tell you, oh, put flowers and stars for the younger kids and put something else for the older groups. That's not a question that any expert can answer. That's a question that your users can answer for you. And so the only way to know how to design for one group versus another is to ask them. Now, How we ask them is its own question, but is an important one to address. When you show people a product and say, hey, here's an app I just built for you. Isn't it awesome? What do you think? Of course, they're going to tell you, yes, it's awesome, right back. So that's not the answer. The answer is to observe user behavior, right? To closely empathize with your user so that you can understand how they would use your product. And so what we do is we do a lot of testing, right? Many of you will be familiar with the lean startup methodologies, this process of building, measuring, and learning. There's a book that's about to come out that I would highly recommend you getting called Sprint, which is written by my friend Jake Knapp, who works at Google Ventures. It's a 5-day process that he outlines that they use at Google Ventures for understanding your user, empathizing with the user. It's built on the basis of this design thinking methodology that we teach at the design school. So the answer to this question of how do we design for different groups is that we empathize with them. We closely understand their issues because it will make the difference between the success or failure of your product. We've got to understand the user intimately. Next question here. I would like to know if there are different triggers that are more effective for children aged 3 to 8 versus children 9 to 12, teenagers and adults. Then I would be interested in learning if there are also differences in what causes them to return to an app. So this deals a little bit with the question we had just a second ago around designing for user empathy, closely understanding our user, and testing. The beautiful thing about building products today is that it's very cheap to test. Right? Many times it's much cheaper to just test the damn thing than it is to argue about what you should be building. There's sites like user testing and there's .com and other resources out there, even bringing in real life people to test your app and then watching how they use your product. These things can be done with zero code, right? I've tested products effectively with slides, right? You crank up a keynote presentation or a PowerPoint, you do some wireframes, you put them into PDFs, you put them on a phone or on a laptop, and you ask people to use the product. And instead of actually connecting anything or writing any code, you just advance them based on what buttons they click. This is very, very simple stuff. And there's all kinds of apps and services out there that make this extremely easy to do. So when it comes to effective triggers or any other part of your application, the answer is to test. Don't argue, just test it. In terms of broad strokes, when it comes to effective triggers at large, what makes for an effective trigger? And if you're not familiar with triggers, that's one of the first chapters in my book. We have 2 types of triggers, external triggers and internal triggers. I think a much more important question than what type of what should a trigger look like is more this question around when should we deliver the trigger. Not what is the trigger, but when should the trigger be delivered, because we've got to closely couple the internal and external trigger together. That's the difference between an external trigger that feels like spam and one that feels like magic. An external trigger that's delivered when it's not needed, meaning when the internal trigger does not exist. An internal trigger is this emotional state, this emotional need that we have when I'm feeling bored, lonesome, fearful, uncertain, indecisive. All of these things are emotionally painful. They're negative valence states. So the key to delivering good external triggers, notifications, messages, emails, is to deliver them at the moment in time when the user feels that internal trigger. That's the key. That's the secret around delivering effective external triggers, no matter what the age group is. Now, when to deliver those triggers is going to be very different for someone who's aged 3 to 8, because their life is very different from someone who's an adult. So the key and the reason why user empathy is so important is that you need to figure out when in the user's day should you be sending that trigger in the first place. Sending a trigger to someone when they're in the middle of work and they can't use the product, they can't use the external trigger, is spammy and annoying, and they're going to uninstall your product. So you've got to figure out when in their day they're most likely to have the emotional itch to need the product so that they actually use the product when you send them the external trigger. Okay, that's the key takeaway here. And that's a very important lesson that way too many people building technologies do not think about. They send notifications and messages and external triggers on their schedule as opposed to the user's schedule. Let me do a quick check-in here. Is this going in the right direction? Is this how you wanted me to answer these?
Yeah, it's perfect so far. I just encourage everyone else to, if they have any additional questions, to submit those via the Google Hangout, or you can email the Adult Literacy XPRIZE email, and we can pass those on during the conversation. But yep, so far so good.
All right, terrific. And yeah, feel free if there's something that I mentioned that isn't clear or that you'd like me to talk more about, then just type it in here, and we can always address them ad hoc. Question number 3, I have attended one of your seminars and I have read your book. Thanks very much. I have already started to incorporate some of your ideas into my product. And the question is, if you had to choose between improving the simplest action done in anticipation of reward versus improving the bits of work to ensure the next pass, which would you choose to do? So this is definitely someone who has read the book, because I can tell by their language that they're using the same language that I use in my talk and in my book. What they're referring to is improving the simplest action done in anticipation of reward. That's the definition of the action phase of the hook. The second part of the question is, should you do that first, or should you ensure that the bit of work ensures the next pass? That's the investment phase of the hook. So basically the question boils down to, which of the 4 steps of the hook should you worry about first? And there's no patent answer for that for every product or every industry. It depends on your product. So when I work with various companies, sometimes the thing that's missing, the thing that's deficient in the product, and the reason it's not forming a consumer habit is because the trigger isn't effective, or the action is too hard, or the variable reward isn't actually rewarding, or the company hasn't built in an effective investment. So it's not that one should be prioritized over the other. It's that if you're building a habit-forming product, you've got to have all 4. Okay, so the one that I would worry about first is the one you don't have. And the reason I built the hook model is, I've helped start 2 companies. I've been very deep into product development for most of my professional career, and I know how difficult it is to build products that people will actually use. So what I wanted to give is this framework that you can ask yourself these series of questions, these 5 fundamental questions that I lay out in the book, so that you can figure out which of those you're missing. And for every product I've worked with that for one reason or another is not engaging users, is not keeping people coming back to the product, they're always missing one or more of those 4 steps of the hook. So the 5 fundamental questions, just so we can get them out on the table, is what's your internal trigger? What's the psychological itch that occurs with sufficient frequency to bring your customer back? Okay. The second question is, what's the external trigger that provides the user with some piece of information to act? So clicking a button, or whatever that might be, to do next. That's the habit itself. The third question and the second stage of the hook is the action phase. What's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward, and how can you make that behavior simpler? And then the next question is the reward variable, and does it leave the user wanting more? And then finally, the last question is, what's the bit of work the user does to increase their likelihood through the next pass of the hook? Again, these questions will make a lot more sense with more context in my book. And also, you can get a free workbook that kind of walks you through these questions on my site, nearandfar.com. Near is spelled like my first name, N-I-R. So the answer to your question is here: which one do you do first? You do the one that's missing. You work on the part of the hook that you don't have. Next question here, number 4. One of the struggles in developing educational software is striking a balance between rewards that drive performance and rewards that drive engagement, the latter of which you describe in Chapter 4, Variable Rewards. The latter does not necessarily drive the former. Do you have any examples of products that have successfully used rewards to drive specific actions beyond engagement? If so, what do you think made them work well? Now, let me think about this question a bit here. Drive performance and rewards that drive engagement. I'm not sure if I understand rewards that drive performance versus those that drive engagement. I don't know if I know the difference here. Maybe the person who wrote this question can come back with a little bit of an explanation. I mean, the goal of rewards, it's the hook model relies a lot on behaviorism, on this idea that rewards create learned associations for future behavior. And this is how habits are formed, right? The brain skips a step of actually having to be mindful of the behavior, and instead we just act, right? We do these behaviors with little or no conscious thought, and about 40% of what we do every day is done out of habit. And so the purpose of the reward is to create an association between the internal trigger, the itch, the need inside the customer's brain, and the product. So that whenever they feel this need, they're automatically using this solution. And so I'm a little bit confused on what this means. What's the difference between one that drives performance versus engagement? They certainly drive engagement. I'm not really sure what performance means in this context. So maybe we'll skip this question and come back to it. Yeah.
Sorry. So someone just chimed in, I think, who I don't think asked the question, but maybe in this context with our teams, maybe performance is referring to improved reading skills.
Right.
I mean, I think, yeah, maybe that's what the context of this question.
Okay. Okay. So how do you balance rewards that that show the user is improving versus those that drive engagement?
Right. So if someone is just using that product and just engaging, but maybe not their reading skills may not be actually improving.
I see. So this gets into an interesting question around gamification, and I'm guessing many of you know what gamification is. It's the use of game-like mechanics in non-gaming environments. So think points and badges and leaderboards. And I'm not the biggest fan of gamification. I'm not against it, but what tends to happen is people apply it inappropriately. And I think that's where this question comes from, is because the person who asked this question sees them as different things. Like, if I'm going to reward somebody for doing something, that takes the form of a badge or a star or, you know, getting higher on a leaderboard, as opposed to the reward around the behavior itself, right? The skill you're learning. And the problem with gamification is that they're external rewards, right? The reward itself has nothing to do with the behavior that you're encouraging, and those are relatively weak rewards. They tend to peter out over time, right? This is where, you know, if you're a parent and you've ever tried using a sticker chart, this is where sticker charts go awry, right? One day you say, hey, if you do this thing for me, I'll give you another sticker. And then invariably at some point your kid will say, no thanks, I don't really want the sticker. And then what do? You're screwed, right? You've got no more rewards to give them. So the best rewards are not these extrinsic rewards that have nothing to do with the behavior itself. The best rewards are the ones that are part and parcel of the behavior itself. And this is the irony, I think, of you know, to get a little bit off track here, of public education. The reason public education, I think, fails so many people is that it's totally decoupled the intrinsic pleasure of learning with the outcome that public education wants, which is higher test scores. And that's a real tragedy. Let's not do that, okay? The benefit, the true reward of what we're trying to do here in increasing literacy is the joy, the pleasure of being able to read, right? That should be the reward. It shouldn't be stars and badges and leaderboards. Those might help in the short term, but the real reward has to be the joy of learning. And the irony is that when we try and teach people at scale, as does the public education system, we do an amazing job of squeezing and juicing all the fun out of learning, unfortunately. Not all the time. I don't mean to characterize all teachers, but many times, you know, when we teach for the test, we squeeze out all the fun. So the best type of reward, the longest lasting, the most effective rewards are ones that are associated with the skill itself. The better you get, you should be rewarded from the experience itself. And there's no better example of that, I think, than literacy, right? The reward of increased literacy is being able to enjoy the magic of books, is being able to be taken to places that otherwise you can't go were it not for the power of amazingly written books and stories. So I hope that's helpful.
Hey, Nir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was a good job answering the question. I think we had another question jump in that's sort of related to this question, and it's, how much can we rely on someone's internal desire to read versus the design of the app to drive their use?
Right. That's a great question. So what I specialize in, what I teach companies, is how to help people do things they want to do. Now, what I can't help anybody do, and I wouldn't want to help anybody do, is to help people do things they don't want to do. The difference is, one is persuasion, which I think is moral and can be used for good, and the other is coercion. So I don't know how to do coercion, and I don't recommend anybody else does coercion, because coercion is when you're getting someone to do something they don't want to do. So what I want to do is to find opportunities, and there are so many out there that there are countless opportunities to help people do a behavior that they want to do, but for lack of good product design, they don't do. Right? That's my goal. I want to find opportunities where people want to get something done, but for the fact that the product is too difficult to use, it's too poorly designed, they can't get the job done. And that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity in the education space, because, fundamentally, I do think people are curious. People want to learn. People want to improve themselves. So that's where we need to look for these opportunities. Don't look for opportunities and try and be missionary to people who don't want the product, because there are so many people who want the product. But it's our job, by following the hook model, by having a willing vessel, right? By having a user that wants to do the behavior and a product that's well designed using the hook model, I think you're golden. Does that answer the question?
Yep, that sounds good. Sorry, I was on mute. But I think we're good for that one, and we can move on to the next one.
Okay. Oh, by the way, just one little asterisk for that last comment. Now, that doesn't mean the user you only have to find the super motivated users, right? I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is you still need a little bit of motivation. For those of you who have seen my talk or read the book, I use the FOG behavior model that shows that even with a tiny bit of motivation, by making the product very, very easy to use, you can create the intended behavior. But you still need a little bit of motivation. So I'm not saying, oh, only go for the people who really, really want to read. That's almost too easy. I'm saying that there's a lot of people there who do want to learn to read, but for whatever reason, the behavior is currently too hard to do. That's our opportunity. Don't go after people who don't want to read, right? And I think part of the problem, again, to keep trashing the public education system, is that many times we try and force education down people's throats who don't want it, particularly children who don't want to be in the classroom in the first place, which I think we should reconsider how we do that. Anyway. Question number 4, did we do this one yet? No, yes, we did do question number 4. Let's do question number 5. People who are low literate are often embarrassed by their reading levels and wouldn't want others to know they're using an app to learn to read. How would you design internal and external triggers to subvert these negative associations? Do you think these negative emotions can be used well in an education app? Have you seen examples of this? So I think this is a terrific question and an amazing opportunity, because the way we used to teach literacy up until a few years ago was only possible in the real world, right? And that's a very heavy behavior. That's a very difficult behavior for a lot of people. They have to figure out where the program is. They have to come to terms with the fact that they have something that they're embarrassed about. They don't want really other people to know. They have to show up in the classroom. They have to tell someone that they're struggling with it. It's a lot of baggage. The beauty of using online tools is that all that work goes away, right? I can learn to read in the comfort of my home with no embarrassment, right? With no risk of someone I don't know finding out that I don't know how to read. I can do that on my own. That's a beautiful thing. And so I think that's really what we want to look for. And as an example, the person who wrote this question asked for some examples. There's several companies I work with that are using hooks for good. The one that comes to mind that I think is most relevant is a company called 7 Cups of Tea. 7 Cups of Tea is this app that connects people together when they need therapy. So they're trying to disrupt the psychotherapy market, and very similarly to literacy, it requires a lot of work. I got to go find a therapist. Who's going to pay for it? When can I go? Do I trust the therapist? There's all these questions. Well, with 7 Cups of Tea, the app is so simple to use. It's so well designed that with just a tap of a button for no money, a parent who's suffering from, who's working with a child who has a disability, or a veteran who's suffering from PTSD, these folks can very quickly be connected with a trained counselor in seconds using this app. And I think that's really the virtue and the beauty of what you all are doing, is that we're eliminating so much of the friction to get the job done by putting these products online as opposed to keeping them in the real world. So the answer to this question around, people find it embarrassing, they don't want others to know they're using a program that helps them learn to read. There's no reason others need to know that, right? We can camouflage it. The app doesn't need to be called Learn to Read. It can be called something else, as long as the person using it knows what it's for. Okay, question 6. Can you talk of examples of how content companies have used variable rewards? So content companies, I'm happy to answer this question. I'm trying to figure out how this relates to adult literacy. Let me see if I can figure it out as I talk. So content companies online, if you think about content on the web in general, when I think of content, I think of news sites. I think of ESPN. I think of BuzzFeed. I think of YouTube. These are all places where they're loaded with content. Still trying to figure out how that applies to the literacy setting. Maybe somebody can help me out with that. The way that we use variable rewards in content settings is pretty obvious, right? The variable reward is what's in the content. What keeps us watching YouTube videos is that clickbait title that says, "You won't believe what this cat does in this video." That's a variable reward. Well, what does the cat do? There's mystery, there's uncertainty there. It's exactly the same phenomenon that keeps people playing slot machines, right? Or checking our news feed on Facebook, right? The reason we keep scrolling and scrolling is searching for that next interesting bit of content. So content should and must be variable. It has to have an element of mystery. If it's not mysterious, if there isn't intrigue, if there isn't this what's called an information gap and it's predictable, then we don't engage, we don't read. So there has to be that bit of mystery, or else people won't stick around. And it looks like we're coming up at the top of the hour here, so let me finish up this last question. In your talk, you spoke about the morality of manipulation. Most of the products you discuss in your presentation are used by educated adults. What additional considerations do you think developers creating products for vulnerable populations should take into account when designing these products? So this is a fantastic question. It's something that I'm very concerned about. I think that along with creating habit-forming products for good, I mean, this is, working with you all is exactly the kind of work I love to do, because it's a direct application of how product design can tremendously improve people's lives by creating these healthy habits. But the downside is that sometimes people will use these techniques for nefarious purposes. My goal here is to educate everyone building products and services, all industries, on how to use this stuff for good. The people who are currently taking up time in our lives, the game companies, the social networks, these companies know exactly how to do what I'm teaching you to do here today. They've known this for quite a while. That's why I want everyone to know how to use these techniques, so we can change people's habits for the better, so that we can improve people's lives using these techniques. But of course, we do need to consider these vulnerable populations, when it comes to children, when it comes to people who are addicted, who have a disorder that might cause them to self-harm by overusing these products. I do think there are special moral considerations for these protected groups, and there are laws, as well as I think the industry needs more ethical codes of conduct around how to treat these populations. I will say that that's generally not the problem that most people face, right? Most companies building products are not worried about people getting addicted. In fact, that most people are worried that nobody's going to use the product they spent years of their life building. But nonetheless, I think it is a concern that we as product makers should address. And at that, I think we're at the top of the hour here. Just one more minute till noon on the Pacific time, at least. Maybe there's time for one more question, and then I'll get going here.
Hi, Nir, it's Devin again. I think we've covered all the questions. I didn't see any other additional questions come through. That said, I think I do want to encourage everyone to email adultliteracyxprize@gmail.com, and any additional questions we can kind of pass on and have those answered. But this will be recorded, and I think we've covered everything at this point. So I'll turn it over to you to wrap it up.
All right, terrific. And just a reminder here, there's the link on your screen for my blog, nirandfar.com. You can sign up for my newsletter. You get a free workbook that can help you build these habit-forming products. And if I can be helpful in the future, feel free to reach out to me. My email is nir@nirandfar.com. gmail.com. I also do office hours every week where we can speak one-on-one. I give out 15-minute blocks of time. If you read the book and you still have a question or you want to talk about your particular challenge, happy to chat further. And I wish you the best of luck. I am a huge advocate for literacy. In college, I started a program called Emory Read at Emory University, and this is a cause that's very near and dear to my heart. So if I can be helpful in the future, please reach out.
Thank you, Nir. We really appreciate it. With that said, we're going to go ahead and conclude this broadcast. And again, this will be recorded, so you can always check it out later. And thank you.